I bought a beach house in a small coastal town. Every night, our neighbors go for a swim in the freezing ocean. My wife and I recently moved to a beach house located on the rugged Pacific Northwest coastline. The cottage with yellow shutters opened out onto sand dunes leading to the ocean. We were surrounded by neighboring cottages, each with the same yellow shutters. We went on our first early morning dog walk with Barry along the ocean front. It was a misty morning, and the waves lapped up onto the beach. It was perfect, a far cry from dog walks in small parks. We passed several dog walkers weaving in and out of the surf. I noticed that they were all barefoot. I slipped off my shoes and socks. I craved to feel the sand beneath my feet. I instantly felt the cold from the wet sand. A wave brushed over my feet. I frowned. The water was freezing. Alice looked at me. "Are you okay?" I faked a smile. "Just a bit chilly." We continued walking along the shoreline and passed several more barefoot dog walkers. My legs were numb, but I was too embarrassed to let on. I thought to myself, how are they able to withstand the cold? My wife looked at me again. "Are you sure you're okay?" The pain was now unbearable. "Shall we explore the town?" I quickly replied. With my shoes and socks back on, we strolled through the small coastal town. There was a small bait shop and a hardware store, but not much else. My legs were still numb, and I needed to warm up. "Shall we get something to drink?" I suggested. "Where?" Alice replied. We walked around for a while looking for a coffee shop but couldn't find one. We passed a middle-aged couple sitting on a bench gazing out at the ocean. I stopped and smiled. "Excuse me, is there a coffee shop nearby?" They continued to gaze out at the ocean. It was like they were in a trance. "We've just moved here," I added. Their eyes lit up. The lady pointed to a nearby street. "Helen's tea room is right around the corner." "Thank you," I replied. The gentleman chuckled. "That'll warm your legs up." I was taken aback by his response. How did he know my legs felt like icicles? We entered a quaint tea room decorated with 19th century antique furniture. The place was packed with locals sitting together and drinking tea. They stopped talking and stared at us. My wife and I exchanged a look. "We must look like tourists," I quipped. A mysterious lady in her late 70s wearing a robe greeted us. My wife nervously smiled. "You have a charming little place." Helen frowned. "Sorry, we are fully booked." I scanned the room and noticed an empty table in the corner. "We've just moved here," I said. She stared at me. "One of the cottages along the beach with the yellow shutters." Helen's eyes lit up. "Please come this way. Let's warm up those legs." Helen poured us a steaming cup of yellowish tea. "Our special blend," she told us. "Do you get many tourists here?" Alice asked. "They leave once it's too cold to swim," she replied. Helen left and poured the yellowish tea to another couple. My wife and I looked at each other and took a sip. The locals watched. The warmth of the tea radiated through my body. I felt a tingling sensation in my legs. The numbness melted away. Later that evening, I took a lukewarm shower and joined Alice in bed. She was asleep on top of the sheets. I opened the bedroom window slightly to let in the cool ocean breeze. It wasn't a hot night, but it felt humid. Tossing and turning, I woke up to Barry's loud barking. I looked at my cell phone. It was 2 a.m. Barry continued to bark louder and louder. I entered the living room and switched on the lights. Barry was jumping up at the window, barking at something outside. I tentatively went outside and picked up a beach stone. My heart was pounding through my chest. What if it was an intruder? Anyone could easily access our property via the beach. I saw a light coming from my neighbor's porch. To my surprise, my neighbor was rinsing off in his outdoor shower. I put down the stone and walked over. My neighbor, who was in his early 40s, Jim Fit, wrapped a towel around his waist. He smiled and extended out his hand. "I'm Jim. You must be our new neighbors." I stared at him in disbelief. "Jim, it's 2 a.m. He casually replied, "Lovely evening for a dip." Surely, he didn't mean the ocean. It's like 50 degrees. you would get hypothermia. Jim kept smiling. You're welcome to join us one night. I just stood there. He turned and went back into his beach house. A patch of salt water on his shoulder absorbed into his yellowish skin. I struggled to go back to sleep. It was too hot, and my mind was racing. Did our crazy neighbor really invite us for a dip in the ocean? I woke up the next morning drenched in sweat. I wearily entered the living room and saw Alice outside on the deck in her nightgown, painting the ocean. I joined her. How long have you been up? I asked. I couldn't sleep. It was too muggy, she replied. She began to paint a yellowish figure swimming in the ocean. I stared at the yellow figure. That's funny you should paint that. I spoke to our neighbor last night. He just got back from his nightly swim in the ocean. Alice looked up. Some people go Arctic swimming. Of course, Alice was right. But the whole encounter still seemed odd. All day, I couldn't stop thinking about my strange interaction with the neighbor. He seemed so relaxed. Why wasn't he shivering? Why was his skin the same yellowish color as in my wife's painting? That evening, I waited up. I had to see with my own eyes if my neighbor went for a swim in the ocean. I was getting tired and nodded off in my deck chair. I awoke to voices coming from the ocean. I crept down to the shoreline. It was pitch black except for a yellowish glow shining off the water. To my utter shock, my neighbors were swimming and bathing in the freezing ocean. Some were diving under the water while others floated on their backs. I crouched behind a sand dune, trying to stay hidden. Jim stood up in the water, and I caught his eye. He smiled and waved for me to join them. I ran as fast as I could back to my beach house. I could hear them splashing in the waves from behind. I locked the doors and closed the shutters. I was sweating profusely. I thought to myself, this is insane. There is no way I could join them. I wouldn't survive. As the weeks passed, we became more settled in. We went on long beach walks with Barry and paddled our feet in the waves. There were still a few tourists around. I remembered thinking, will they ever leave us in peace? We regularly stopped off at Helen's tea room and even bought our own supply of yellow tea. Every night, my wife and I went down to the shore and watched the neighbors enjoying their nightly swim. I was no longer afraid of the freezing ocean, but despite welcoming smiles from our neighbors, I still wasn't ready to venture in. One dark winter evening, I joined my wife for a cold shower. The water felt warm on our skin. After we got out of the shower, we were dry almost immediately. I looked in the mirror and saw a yellowish glow radiate through our naked bodies. That night, we couldn't sleep. We were burning up, and our skin was red hot to the touch. Alice and I looked at each other and knew exactly what we needed to do. In our swimwear, we walked hand in hand through the sand dunes and joined our neighbors in the ocean. Our neighbors smiled at us and carried on swimming. As I submerged into the ocean, the freezing water soothed my flaming skin. I bathed and splashed around. I was in a state of euphoria. Over the next several nights, we joined our neighbors in the ocean. It was the highlight of my day. The thought of the ice-cold water hitting my skin and the feeling of truly belonging was intoxicating. It consumed my every waking moment. One evening, as we prepared for our nightly swim by taking an ice bath and drinking the yellow tea on the deck, we saw a group of young travelers on the beach, sitting around a campfire. My wife and I frowned. How dare they spoil our perfect evening? As we walked down to the shore, an argument erupted between our neighbors and the travelers. There was lots of swearing back and forth. The neighbors engulfed the travelers and, to my shock, dragged them into the ocean. The travelers were screaming and thrashing about as they were held under the freezing water. I ran into the ocean, but it was too late. Everything went silent. The travelers were floating face down. I desperately tried to pull their lifeless bodies back to the shore, but the tide was too strong. The neighbors bathed and swam like nothing ever happened. Back at our beach house, my wife and I were panicking. We need to call the cops, Alice cried. It would be our word against the neighbors, I exclaimed. There's no way the cops would believe our nightly swims and our resistance to the freezing ocean. It would be ruled a tragic accident involving drunk tourists. The next morning, we woke up on the bathroom tiles. We couldn't sleep as we were burning up and needed to take turns going in and out of the shower. I went outside to get some fresh air and saw Jim setting off for his morning run. He smiled at me. How can he possibly smile? Does he even realize that he murdered innocent people last night? My wife and I decided to clear our heads and take Barry on a long walk. I couldn't help but look at the majestic scenery. The jagged cliffs and the waves crashing against the boulders. There was a brief moment where I forgot about last night. As we walked back, we passed a young family with a 5-year-old little girl. The mother politely asked, "Is there anywhere that sells ice cream?" "It's not summer," I abruptly answered. The mother and father exchanged a look and continued on. Their daughter looked upset. It then dawned on me that I was becoming like my neighbors and that they were in danger. I quickly caught up to them. "You need to leave." The family hurried away from me. I shouted out, "It's not safe for tourists." That evening, we decided to not go for our nightly swim. How could we after what we witnessed? We stayed in our ice bath, but the temperature kept rising, and the water started to boil. We were getting cooked alive and had no choice but to go into the ocean. "One little swim," I said. We quickly headed down to the shore and entered the ocean. We avoided our neighbors who swam and bathed in what might as well have been the traveler's blood. My wife and I swam for our lives, desperately trying to get the heat off us. Eventually, we cooled down and swam back to the shore, where we heard a muffled cry. Our neighbors were dragging the young family kicking and screaming from a nearby beach house they were renting. The neighbors savagely submerged the mother and father. I swam over as fast as I could and tried to fight them off, but they held me back. They were too possessed, their eyes bright yellow. The little girl was left struggling to stay afloat, her arms and legs no longer able to move in the freezing water. The mother and father stopped fighting and went limp. With her last gasp, the mother cried out to me, "Save her." The little girl was taken under by a large wave. I dived deep into the water and saw her lifeless body sinking to the seabed. I grabbed her arm and pulled her to the shore. My wife and I carried the unconscious little girl to our beach house. In the background, the neighbors continued to bathe and swim with smiles on their faces. Back at the beach house, we laid the little girl down on the couch. She had gone blue and was hyperventilating. I wrapped her up in sheets, but she was still unresponsive. "We need to call 911. Alice cried. "There's no time," I replied. I looked over to the pot of tea on the kitchen counter. I gently poured the tea down her throat. A yellow glow passed through her veins. We waited with bated breath. Her eyes flashed open. Even after witnessing our neighbors' ritual killings, we could never leave the beach house. We needed our nightly swims to survive. The little girl became our daughter. She was too young to remember what happened, and now that she's older, she even goes swimming in the ocean with her friends. Every day, my wife and I walk Barry along the ocean front, and if we see a tourist, we warn them to leave.